The first signs of trouble did not arrive with noise or warning. There were no explosions in the sky and no clear message that something had gone wrong. Instead, it began with silence in the places where silence should never exist. Communication channels that had always been stable suddenly stopped responding. Military monitoring stations that had operated without interruption for years showed empty screens and frozen data. At first, the technicians thought it was a system fault. Something simple. Something fixable. Within minutes, that belief started to break. Across different parts of the world, similar reports came in. Radar systems that tracked air movement went dark at the same time. Satellite feeds started dropping one after another, not in a random pattern, but in a way that looked coordinated. It was this detail that made early responders uneasy. A normal technical failure does not behave like a chain reaction. Yet here, everything seemed to fail together, almost as if something had reached out and switched off entire layers of global awareness. Inside command centers, confusion grew quickly. Officers tried switching to backup systems, but even those showed irregular behavior. Data was either missing or delayed in strange ways. It was not just loss of signal. It felt like the information itself was being held back. Technicians kept checking physical hardware, rerouting connections, and restarting servers, but nothing brought the systems back to full function. Every fix led to another failure, somewhere else. At the highest levels of government, emergency protocols were activated. Early assessments suggested a large-scale cyber disruption. That idea made sense at first. A powerful attack on digital infrastructure could explain outages across multiple countries. But as more reports came in, that explanation started to feel too small for what was happening. The systems that failed were not all connected in the same way. Some were completely isolated from public networks, yet they were affected too. Military analysts began comparing notes across regions. What they found made the situation more serious. The timing of each failure was too precise. In some cases, systems separated by thousands of kilometers went dark within seconds of each other. This level of coordination was not something seen before. It suggested intelligence, planning, and access that went far beyond ordinary threats. In cities, people were still going about their routines, unaware of how quickly the situation was changing behind closed doors. News channels had limited information, and official statements were careful with their wording. They spoke about technical issues and ongoing investigations, avoiding anything that might cause panic. But inside secure rooms, the tone was very different. Their concern was turning into urgency. As the hours passed, the problem expanded instead of slowing down. Air traffic systems began reporting errors. Navigation tools became unreliable in certain regions. Even secure military communication lines showed delays that could not be explained by normal interference. Every layer of global coordination seemed to be weakening at the same time. One of the most alarming discoveries came when analysts noticed that the failures were not just passive. In some cases, systems appeared to respond briefly before shutting down, as if something was interacting with them directly. It was not a simple blackout. It was more like a controlled shutdown happening from an unknown source. This possibility changed everything. If systems were being actively targeted and controlled, then the situation was not just a technical failure. It was an organized action, possibly with intelligence behind it. Emergency meetings turned into crisis discussions. Leaders demanded clearer answers, but even the best experts had none that were certain. By the time the first full day reached its midpoint, a quiet fear had spread to the highest levels of global command. Something was happening on a scale that no one fully understood. It was not just a loss of technology. It was a feeling that control itself was slipping away, piece by piece, in a pattern that no one could predict or stop. And still, there was no face to the enemy. Only signals fading, systems falling silent, and a world slowly realizing that whatever was behind us was already far ahead in the game. The situation did not stay hidden for long. Once the first wave of system failure spread, it became impossible for governments to treat it as a small technical issue. What started as confusion quickly turned into full emergency response across continents. Communication lines between nations were opened immediately, and urgent discussions began at the highest levels. Every country wanted answers, but no one had anything solid to offer. At first, there was still hope that this was a large cyber attack. That explanation was easier to accept. It meant there was an enemy that could be identified, tracked, and eventually stopped. But as more intelligence reports came in, that hope started to fade. The pattern of disruption did not match any known cyber warfare method. It was too wide, too fast, and too precise at the same time. Different regions began sharing data in real time. What they discovered added to fear. The failures were not random. They were happening in a way that suggested planning across global systems. Power grids in one area, satellite networks in another, and military communication systems elsewhere were all affected almost simultaneously. Even systems that were physically separated and had no digital connection to each other were impacted in similar ways. Inside emergency command centers, analysts worked without rest. Large screens displayed maps filled with red zones marking affected infrastructure. These maps kept expanding as new reports came in. Every hour, another layer of systems stopped responding. Backup systems were activated, but even those began to show instability. The sense of control that global institutions depended on was slowly slipping away. Civilians were still not fully aware of the scale of the problem. Official statements remained calm, describing technical disruptions and ongoing investigations. However, behind closed doors, the language was very different. Words like coordinated, unknown capability, and system-wide failure were now being used. Leaders were beginning to understand that this was not a normal threat situation. It was something they had never prepared for. Air traffic control was one of the first major concerns. Several airports reported sudden loss of radar accuracy. Flights had to be rerouted manually, causing delays and confusion. At the same time, navigation systems used by emergency services started behaving unpredictably in certain regions. These issues did not happen everywhere, but the places affected seemed to shift without warning. Military forces went on high alert. Defense systems were checked repeatedly and offline protocols were activated. But even secure military networks showed unusual delays and missing data packets. In some cases, encrypted messages arrived incomplete, as if something had interrupted the mid-transfer. This raised serious concern because secure channels were supposed to be protected from outside interference. One of the most troubling findings came when analysts compared timestamps from different systems. The failures were happening with extreme precision. In multiple locations across the world, systems stopped working within seconds of each other. That level of timing suggested coordination beyond human scale. It did not behave like natural disruption or even typical sabotage. It felt synchronized. As panic slowly built inside decision-making rooms, another problem emerged. There was no clear point of origin. No country, no network, no identifiable source of attack. It was as if the disruption was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This lack of direction made it harder to respond because there was nothing concrete to target. In some regions, local authorities tried to isolate affected systems to prevent further spread. In other places, entire communication networks were temporarily shut down as a precaution. But even these defensive moves had mixed results. Some areas stabilized briefly, while others experienced sudden new failures right after isolation attempts. The most unsettling part was the behavior of certain systems just before they went offline. In a few documented cases, machines appeared to respond briefly, almost as if acknowledging commands that were not sent by any known operator. Then they shut down completely. These moments were rare, but they left a strong impression on the teams studying them. By the end of the day, global leadership was forced to accept a difficult reality. This was not a short-term disruption. It was an ongoing event that was actively changing and adapting. Every attempt to understand it only revealed more gaps in knowledge. The world was still standing, but its systems were clearly under pressure from something far beyond normal experience. And in the middle of all this uncertainty, one thing became clear to everyone involved. Whatever was causing this was not finished yet. By the time the second wave of disruption settled into a tense pattern, it became clear that waiting for answers from official channels would not be enough. Large institutions were still trying to understand the scale of what was happening, but smaller, faster groups began taking action on their own. These were not formal armies or government units operating in the open. They were scattered teams of specialists, engineers, and communication experts working quietly in the background, often without clear coordination from above. In many regions, local defense units were given limited authority to act independently. Their first task was not to fight anything directly, but to gather reliable information from areas where systems were still partially working. This was difficult because even basic communication tools were unstable. Messages would arrive delayed, incomplete, or not at all. Still, these small groups managed to build fragments of understanding by comparing what little data they could collect. One of the first patterns they noticed was that the disruption was not affecting all systems equally. Some older, simpler networks were still functioning, while highly advanced systems were failing almost instantly when exposed to the same conditions. This difference gave investigators an important clue. It suggested that the unknown force or mechanism behind the attack was interacting more easily with complex, highly connected infrastructure. As this information spread, efforts began to focus on creating isolated environments. In simple terms, teams started building small, controlled systems that were not connected to the larger global network. These isolated systems became testing grounds. If something was interfering from the outside, then these protected environments might reveal how it worked or at least survive long enough to study it. At first, results were limited. Many isolated systems still failed in unpredictable ways. But in a few locations, something different happened. When communication links were carefully restricted and layered with older backup methods, the systems remained stable for longer periods than expected. This was the first small sign that the disruption was not absolute. It had conditions, patterns, and limits that could potentially be understood. This discovery gave a cautious sense of direction. Instead of trying to restore everything at once, efforts shifted toward understanding how the interference spread. Analysts began mapping every confirmed failure, looking for hidden connections. They examined timing, location, and system type in extreme detail. Slowly, a more structured picture began to form, though it was still incomplete. At the same time, pressure was increasing in command centers around the world. Leaders were demanding faster solutions, but the teams on the ground were working with limited tools and constant uncertainty. Every time a small improvement was found, another unexpected failure appeared elsewhere. It was like trying to fix a moving target that kept changing shape. Despite this, small breakthroughs started to appear. In a few cases, teams managed to interrupt the disruption for short periods by manually switching systems into fully offline modes. During these windows, communication briefly stabilized. Data could be transmitted without interference, but the effect never lasted long. Once systems were reconnected, instability often returned. One of the most concerning observations came from regions where multiple systems failed in a tightly linked sequence. Investigators noticed that once one system collapsed, nearby systems often follow within seconds or minutes. This suggested a chain reaction effect, where failure in one point influenced others in a structured way. It was not random collapse. It behaved more like a controlled sequence. Inside secure analysis rooms, discussions became more focused and serious. Experts started considering the possibility that the disruption was not just breaking systems, but actively managing how they failed. This idea changed the entire approach. Instead of only trying to defend systems, teams now had to think about how to break the pattern of control itself. Field units continued to work under difficult conditions. In some areas, they had to operate with minimal technology, relying on manual methods that had been largely forgotten in modern operations. Paper records, direct communication lines, and physical coordination became important again. It was slow, but it helped maintain some level of stability when digital systems could not be trusted. As time passed, a strange balance began to form. The disruption was still active, but it was no longer spreading as freely as before. Certain areas were holding steady, while others remained unpredictable. This uneven pattern gave investigators hope that the situation was not completely beyond control. Still, there was no clear understanding of what was behind it. No confirmed source, no identity, only behavior patterns and technical traces that pointed towards something highly organized and intelligent in its execution. By the end of this phase, one fact was impossible to ignore. Humanity was not dealing with a simple breakdown of systems. It was facing something that appeared to learn, adjust, and respond. And even though small progress had been made, the real challenge was still waiting ahead, deeper in the unknown. The turning point did not come with a single dramatic moment. It arrived slowly, through small observations that built up over time until they could no longer be ignored. After days of scattered failures and partial recoveries, analysts began to notice something unusual in the way the disruptions behaved. The pattern was no longer fully expanding. In certain regions, the spread of system failures seemed to slow down, almost as if it was meeting resistance. At first, this was difficult to trust. Many experts believed it could be a temporary pause, a natural shift in the system's behavior. But as more data came in, the pattern became clearer. The disruptions were still present, but they were no longer moving with the same speed or coordination as before. In some places, systems that had gone dark began to respond again, even if only in limited ways. This change triggered immediate attention in global command centers. For the first time since the crisis began, there was a sense that the situation might not be completely beyond influence. Teams worked quickly to confirm whether the slowdown was real or just a fluctuation in the data. They compared records from multiple regions, checking timestamps, system logs, and communication traces. The results pointed in the same direction. Something in the overall structure of the disruption had changed. A new theory started to form. Instead of a single unstoppable force, analysts began to consider that the system behind the disruption might depend on coordination across multiple points. If that coordination was interrupted, even slightly, it could create instability in the entire structure. This idea shifted the focus from defense to disruption of the disruption itself. Working from this idea, coordinated efforts were planned across different regions. The goal was not to restore everything at once, but to create controlled interference in specific parts of the system at the same time. This required careful timing and communication, even with limited tools. Many operations had to be planned manually, using backup channels that were slower but more reliable. In several locations, teams began isolating critical infrastructure nodes. These were points where communication and data flow were heavily concentrated. By temporarily disconnecting these nodes in controlled way, analysts hoped to break the patterns that allowed the disruption to spread smoothly. It was a risky approach because it meant sacrificing short-term stability for the chance of long-term recovery. As these actions were carried out, the effects began to show. In some regions, the disruption response became delayed. Instead of immediate system failure, there were gaps of time where systems remained stable after intervention. These gaps were small, but they were extremely important. They suggested that the controlling mechanism was struggling to react to unexpected changes. For the first time, the behavior of the disruption showed signs of confusion. In certain monitored zones, responses came too late or in the wrong sequence. Systems that were expected to fail remained active, while others shut down without clear triggers. This inconsistency was a major shift from the earlier highly coordinated behavior. Inside analysis centers, this was seen as a breakthrough moment, not because the crisis was over, but because the system behind it was no longer perfect. It had weaknesses, and those weaknesses could be used. Teams immediately began refining their approach, focusing on creating more controlled interruptions at the same time across wider regions. At the same time, field operations continued under difficult conditions. In areas where systems were still unstable, teams relied on simplified communication methods to maintain coordination. Despite the limitations, cooperation between regions improved. The shared understanding that the disruption could be influenced created a new sense of urgency and focus. However, caution remained high. Every improvement came with the risk of sudden reversal. In some cases, systems that had stabilized briefly would fail again after reconnecting to larger networks. This made it clear that the underlying mechanism was still active and adapting. It had not been defeated, only disrupted. One of the most important observations during this phase was that the system seemed to react more slowly when faced with multiple simultaneous changes. When isolated actions were taken in one place, the response was quick and effective. But when several regions acted together, the response became delayed and less coordinated. This reinforced the idea that timing and coordination were key to weakening its control. By the end of this phase, the global situation had not fully recovered, but the direction had changed. Instead of moving deeper into chaos, there were now small signs of resistance that were holding. Systems were not fully restored, but they were no longer collapsing at the same rate. The world was still in a fragile state. But for the first time since the beginning of the crisis, there was a growing understanding that the unknown force behind it was not untouchable. It could be interrupted. It could be slowed. And with enough precision and coordination, it might eventually be broken. The final phase of the crisis did not begin with celebration or relief. It began with pressure. Even though the disruption had slowed and become unstable in many regions, it was still present across global systems. Communication lines were partially restored, but they were fragile. Power grids were functioning in some areas, while still unstable in others. Every improvement came with the risk of sudden collapse again. The situation was no longer falling apart, but it was not fully under control either. After the earlier turning point, global coordination became more structured. Instead of scattered responses, teams now worked in synchronized patterns. Each region was assigned specific tasks, not to fight the disruption directly, but to target its remaining points of coordination. Analysts believe that the system behind the crisis depended on timing and connection between multiple active zones. If those connections were fully broken, the system would lose its ability to operate as a whole. The new plan focused on precision. Large-scale shutdowns were avoided because they created instability. Instead, smaller and carefully timed interruptions were used. These were carried out across multiple regions at the same moment. The goal was to prevent the system from adapting quickly enough to respond. It was a strategy built on coordination, patience, and careful control. As these operations began, the response from the disruption became weaker. In earlier phases, any attempt to interfere would trigger immediate and widespread failure. Now, the reactions were delayed and inconsistent. Some systems failed as expected, but others remained active longer than before. In a few cases, systems that were expected to shut down continued running without interruption. This inconsistency was a strong sign that the underlying structure was breaking down. For the first time since the crisis began, analysts observed a clear reduction in synchronization. The disruption no longer moved as a single coordinated wave. Instead, it behaved like separate fragments that were no longer fully connected. Each fragment reacted on its own, without the same level of precision seen earlier. This was a major shift. It meant the central control mechanism was losing its influence. Field teams continued their work carefully, knowing that the situation could still reverse. In several regions, communication systems were slowly returning to normal. Emergency services regained partial control, and data networks began stabilizing. However, there were still isolated areas where systems remained unstable, requiring constant monitoring. One of the most important developments came when multiple regions successfully completed a synchronized interruption without triggering a full system response. This had not been possible earlier in the crisis. It showed that the disruption was no longer able to predict or fully counter-coordinated actions. That moment marked a silent but powerful shift in control. Despite this progress, there was no certainty. Experts warned that the system could still adapt if given enough time. It had already shown the ability to change behavior under pressure. So, the focus remained on maintaining consistent pressure across all known weak points, while avoiding any gaps that could allow recovery. Over time, the results became more visible. System failures decreased in frequency. Recovery times improved. Communication channels that had been completely lost began to return in stages. It was not a sudden recovery, but a gradual rebuilding of stability. Each small improvement added to the overall progress. Eventually, the disruption reached a point where it could no longer maintain consistent behavior. Its actions became scattered, delayed, and increasingly ineffective. Systems that were once highly vulnerable now resisted interference for longer periods. The structure that had once controlled global systems was no longer operating as a unified force. In the final confirmed phase of operations, coordinated efforts across multiple regions completed a full cycle of controlled stabilization. After this point, no large-scale system failures were recorded. Remaining issues were isolated and handled individually. The crisis that had once affected global infrastructure on an unprecedented scale had finally been contained. However, the end of active disruption did not bring complete answers. Despite extensive analysis, no clear origin was ever identified. No single source was confirmed. No direct explanation was found that could fully describe what happened or why it behaved the way it did. Only patterns, effects, and fragments of data remained. In the aftermath, global systems were rebuilt with new caution. Communication networks were redesigned with additional layers of protection. Emergency protocols were updated to handle threats that did not fit traditional models. The world had regained control, but the experience left a lasting impact on how technology and global systems were understood. Even after stability returned, one idea stayed in every analysis room and decision center. The crisis had not just been about systems failing. It had been about something that interacted with them in ways that were still not fully understood. And while the immediate danger was gone, the questions it left behind remained open, reminding everyone that some events cannot yet be fully explained.